Just weeks ago, a documentary appeared on Netflix without asking for permission. No countdown, no press tour, no dramatic warning. Sean Combs. The reckoning arrived quietly, and that silence was the first thing that made people uneasy. Because when something powerful doesn't need noise to be noticed, it usually means it knows exactly what it's doing. At first, viewers thought they were pressing play on another industry retrospective. Music, success, legacy. But within minutes, the tone felt different. The pacing was slow, deliberate, almost restrained. Old footage appeared, not the loud moments, not the highlights, but the in-between spaces, hallways, after-parties, pauses that lasted just a second too long. It wasn't telling you what to think. It was daring you to notice. What made it unsettling wasn't what was said. It was what wasn't. No accusations shouted, no dramatic conclusions forced, just timelines placed side by side, expressions lingering, context quietly rearranged. Moments that once felt ordinary suddenly felt heavy when viewed without excuses attached. And then there was the presence behind it all, 50 Cent. Not arguing on screen, not delivering speeches.
I have released Diddy's documentary on Netflix, and I have given all the proofs of who was involved with Diddy. I have presented the videotape of Diddy's parties as evidence. Now no one can save Diddy and the other celebs. Jay-Z, Beyonce, Oprah Winfrey, Kim Kardashian, all of them were Diddy's handlers. After watching the rest of the documentary, you'll understand everything.
I kind of like Diddy.
My favorite hero?
And I have a lot of guys that I look up to their accomplishments, but I wouldn't call them my heroes.
Right. You don't wear another man's jersey on your back.
Yeah.
Respect. Your favorite villain?
My favorite villain?
But shaping the rhythm of the story, choosing when to let silence sit, when to slow down, when to let a single clip play just long enough for discomfort to settle in. He wasn't presenting verdicts. He was presenting patterns. And patterns are harder to dismiss. As clips circulated online, people didn't react with instant outrage. They reacted with focus. Scenes were replayed frame by frame. Old interviews resurfaced. Lines that once sounded harmless now felt unfinished. The conversation shifted from "is this real?" to "how did we miss this?" Before we go deeper, take a moment to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and hit the bell icon so you don't miss what comes next. Because this story doesn't unfold loudly, it unfolds slowly, and the details matter. What followed wasn't chaos, it was quiet tension. Industry figures avoided commenting, lawyers declined interviews, familiar faces stayed silent. And in moments like this, silence doesn't calm things down, it sharpens them. Because when everyone knows a conversation has started, pretending it isn't happening only draws more attention to it. The documentary didn't frame itself as an attack. It framed itself as memory, as history revisited with a clearer lens. It suggested, without declaring, that power doesn't always move openly. Sometimes it moves through access, through decisions made behind closed doors, through who gets platforms and who quietly doesn't. By the end of this opening stretch, one thing was clear. This wasn't about one clip or one name. It was about control, about how narratives are shaped, about how certain questions stay unasked for years, until the right moment forces them into the open. And once those questions are out there, they don't go away. They wait, they grow, and they change how everything that follows is seen. As the documentary settled into public consciousness, attention began shifting toward the voice that refused to soften its tone, not because it was louder than everyone else, but because it wasn't. While others measured their words, 50 Cent leaned into something far more uncomfortable: consistency. He didn't suddenly appear with a new narrative. He returned with the same questions he had been asking for years, questions that once sounded like provocation, but now felt like warning. What separates him from most industry figures isn't volume, it's position. According to his own statements over the years, he has never depended on quiet approval or polished alliances to survive. He built his career confronting systems head-on, even when it cost him access. And in a culture where access is everything, that makes him dangerous in a very specific way. The documentary doesn't present him as a hero. It presents him as a contrast. While some figures cultivated distance, refinement, and silence, 50 Cent leaned into friction. He challenged decisions publicly. He mocked power instead of negotiating with it. And when the industry moved on, he stayed exactly where he was, watching. That history matters, because when he revisits old rivalries now, they don't sound like unresolved beef. They sound like unresolved structure. What once looked like personality clashes begin to resemble philosophical ones. Loud disruption versus quiet control. Transparency versus management. Presence versus polish. The documentary carefully revisits moments where paths crossed but never merged. Platforms built side by side. Opportunities opened for some and closed for others. Careers that surged while others stalled without explanation. No accusations are made. No conclusions are drawn. The audience is simply shown the sequence and invited to sit with the discomfort of alignment. This is where Jay-Z enters the conversation, not as a villain, not as a target, but as a symbol of a different kind of power. Controlled, strategic, immaculately presented. Where 50 Cent challenges systems from the outside, Jay-Z is often described as someone who learned how to operate inside them, and that contrast fuels everything that follows. According to 50 Cent's public commentary, power doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it refines itself. Sometimes it builds credibility so slowly and carefully that it becomes untouchable. And when power reaches that stage, it doesn't need to respond to criticism. It lets silence do the work. The documentary doesn't say one approach is right and the other is wrong. It asks something far more unsettling. Which one shapes outcomes more effectively? The one who disrupts openly, or the one who moves quietly while everyone else argues? As viewers absorb this contrast, something subtle happens. The story stops feeling like it's about individuals. It starts feeling like it's about design, about how systems reward certain behaviors and punish others without ever making those rules explicit. By the time this chapter closes, the audience understands one crucial thing. This isn't a clash of personalities. It's a clash of methods. And when methods collide, the fallout doesn't look like conflict. It looks like silence, delayed reactions, and power that never has to explain itself. That realization lingers, because once you see it, you start seeing it everywhere. As the conversation deepened, the focus shifted away from personalities and towards something far less visible, but far more powerful. The mechanics behind success, the moves that never make headlines, the decisions that shape careers without ever being announced. The documentary begins laying these moments side by side. Not dramatically, not aggressively, just sequentially. One artist rises fast, another stalls just as momentum builds. A platform launches with promises of equity and collaboration, then quietly consolidates under one direction. No single moment feels explosive on its own, but together they form a pattern that's difficult to unsee. According to 50 Cent's long-standing commentary, the industry doesn't need to block you publicly to stop you. It just needs to redirect attention. Delay a release. Change a playlist placement. Close a door without ever admitting it existed. Power, in this version of events, works best when it looks like coincidence. The documentary revisits familiar names, not to accuse, but to contextualize. Artists who once seemed unstoppable. Deals that sounded fair on paper. Opportunities that arrived with conditions no one talked about openly. Viewers are reminded that success in this world isn't only about talent. It's about who controls the lanes. What makes this section unsettling is how normal it all feels. Nothing illegal, nothing overt, just leverage. Relationships. Influence layered over time. The kind of influence that doesn't need force, because it's already built into the system. 50 Cent has often described this as a quiet hierarchy, one where being difficult, even when you're right, comes with consequences. Where refusing to align doesn't get you punished publicly, but it does get you remembered differently. According to him, the industry never forgets who doesn't play along. The documentary doesn't ask viewers to pick sides. It asks them to reconsider how many careers they assumed faded naturally, how many opportunities they believed were missed due to timing or luck, and how many of those explanations were simply easier than confronting the idea of control. As scenes unfold, the story moves beyond individual disputes and into something broader. Culture itself. Who decides what sound dominates? Which narratives get celebrated? Which ones quietly disappear? And how influence at the top filters down into everything the audience eventually sees and hears. There's a moment where the film lingers, not on footage, but on absence. Names that should be here but aren't. Voices that once mattered, now reduced to footnotes. The silence feels intentional, because sometimes what's missing says more than what's shown. By the end of this stretch, the audience realizes the stakes are higher than any feud. This isn't about winning an argument. It's about understanding a system that rarely reveals its rules, a system where power doesn't always crush. It redirects, reshapes, and waits. And once you start seeing that pattern, it becomes impossible to believe everything unfolded by chance. As the picture widened, the documentary slowed down again, almost deliberately, forcing attention onto something most people prefer not to examine. Silence. Not the absence of sound, but the presence of restraint. The kind that spreads through an industry quietly, teaching people what not to say without ever spelling it out. The film suggests that silence isn't accidental. It's learned. It's passed down. New artists don't arrive knowing the rules, but they learn them quickly by watching what happens to those who speak too freely. Careers don't always end with explosions. Sometimes they simply fade. Calls stop coming. Invitations disappear. Momentum dissolves without explanation. According to commentary surrounding the documentary, this is how survival works at the highest levels. You don't challenge power directly. You don't ask questions publicly. You protect access at all costs. Because access isn't just opportunity, it's safety. And losing it can feel worse than failure. The documentary revisits moments when people almost spoke, interviews where answers stopped short, statements that felt rehearsed, body language that suggested more was being held back than shared. None of it framed as guilt, none of it framed as innocence, just hesitation. Repetition, patterns of restraint. What makes this uncomfortable is how familiar it feels. Viewers recognize it from other industries, other moments, other scandals. The same pause before a sentence, the same careful wording, the same insistence on moving forward without ever looking back. The story hints that silence often disguises itself as professionalism, as maturity, as knowing better than to get involved. But beneath that surface, silence becomes a currency. Those who spend it wisely remain inside the circle. Those who don't, drift out. The documentary doesn't accuse anyone of enforcing this. It doesn't need to. It shows how the system enforces itself. People watch what happens to others and adjust accordingly. No threats required, no warnings issued, just observation. At this point, the narrative begins to feel heavier, not because new information is revealed, but because the implications sink in. If silence is this effective, how many stories were never told? How many moments were explained away because speaking felt riskier than forgetting? The film lingers on this idea, letting it breathe. It allows the audience to sit with the possibility that what they've seen over the years, successes, failures, disappearances, may not have been random. They may have been guided by invisible boundaries no one publicly acknowledges. As this realization settles, the tone shifts subtly. The conversation is no longer about individual choices. It's about atmosphere, about an environment where silence becomes instinctive and instinct becomes policy. And once silence reaches that level, it stops being neutral. It starts shaping outcomes. As the documentary moves forward, the focus shifts to something far more subtle and far more unsettling than any direct claim. Proximity, not guilt, not innocence, just closeness. The kind that naturally raises questions without ever forming accusations. The film doesn't point fingers. It places people in rooms, on stages, at events, overlapping timelines, shared platforms, familiar faces appearing again and again in the same spaces over long stretches of time. The viewer isn't told what to conclude. They're asked to notice what repetition looks like when it stops feeling accidental. This is where the conversation becomes uncomfortable, because proximity doesn't prove anything, but it does challenge the idea of ignorance. When people move within the same circles for years, attend the same gatherings, collaborate on the same ventures, the question isn't who did what, it becomes who knew what and when. According to commentary surrounding the documentary, this is the question power hates most. Not because it demands an answer, but because it can't be dismissed easily. You can deny actions, you can dispute timelines, but you can't erase shared presence. The film revisits moments where alliances were publicly celebrated. Smiles, applause, joint appearances framed as unity. At the time, these moments symbolized success. Now, viewed through a different lens, they feel heavier. Not sinister, just unresolved. What's striking is how carefully the documentary avoids conclusions. It never says, this means that. It simply allows the audience to feel the tension of unanswered questions. And that restraint is intentional, because when a film doesn't tell you what to think, you end up thinking longer. As this section unfolds, viewers begin to recognize a pattern in how influence operates. Relationships don't just create opportunity, they create insulation. Being close to power can protect you from scrutiny or place you at the center of it when narratives shift. The documentary suggests that proximity can be both shield and spotlight. It elevates some while complicating others. And when conversations finally surface, those connections become impossible to ignore. What makes this moment linger is the absence of response. No one rushes to clarify. No one fills the silence. Statements remain carefully worded if they appear at all, and that quiet stretches, leaving space for interpretation. At this point, the audience realizes the film isn't trying to expose secrets. It's exposing discomfort. The kind that comes from realizing some questions don't need answers to be powerful. Because once proximity is visible, denial stops being convincing. And even without accusations, the conversation has already changed. As the story continues, the lens turns towards something the industry understands better than anyone else. Image. Not reputation, but design. The careful construction of how someone is seen, remembered, and ultimately trusted. The documentary doesn't rush this moment. It slows down, almost inviting the viewer to reflect on how perception is built over time. How someone can evolve from raw beginnings into a symbol of refinement. How language changes. How posture changes. How silence becomes elegance instead of avoidance. This is where branding stops being marketing and starts becoming armor. The film revisits the transformation that audiences applauded for years. The shift from street credibility to boardroom authority, from unpredictable to dependable, from controversial to curated, every step celebrated as growth, every change framed as maturity, and in many ways, it was. But the documentary asks a quieter question beneath the applause. What does that transformation protect? According to long-standing commentary echoed throughout the film, Respectability changes how scrutiny works. People ask different questions. They assume different answers. They hesitate before challenging someone who appears controlled, polished, and successful by every visible metric. Doubt feels inappropriate. Skepticism feels rude. The documentary doesn't argue that image is fake. It argues that image is powerful, powerful enough to redirect attention, powerful enough to decide which stories are told and which ones are quietly set aside as unnecessary. Old clips resurface. Acceptance speeches, business announcements, carefully chosen words delivered at the right moments. None of them troubling on their own. But together, they show how consistency creates credibility, and credibility creates protection. What makes this section compelling is how familiar it feels. Viewers recognize this pattern far beyond music. In politics, in business, in media. The better someone performs stability, the less people question the foundation beneath it. The documentary suggests that once someone reaches this level, criticism has to pass through layers before it ever reaches them. Lawyers, advisors, publicists, each one smoothing edges, refining language, ensuring nothing lands too sharply. Meanwhile, those without that infrastructure don't get the same grace. Their mistakes define them. Their questions get labeled disruptive. Their voices sound inconvenient instead of insightful. This contrast hangs in the air as the film moves forward. It's no longer about who is right or wrong. It's about who is believed. And belief, once established, is incredibly difficult to reverse. By the time this chapter closes, the audience understands something crucial. Power doesn't always silence critics by force. Sometimes it simply outgrows them. And once that happens, accountability has to work twice as hard just to be heard. That realization lingers because it reframes everything that came before and everything that's about to follow. As the documentary moves forward, something subtle begins to happen. The past starts feeling heavier, not because new information is introduced, but because old moments are suddenly impossible to watch the same way again. Clips that once felt casual now feel unfinished. Jokes land differently. Pauses stretch longer than they used to. Interviews that once sounded confident now sound careful. The audience realizes they're not learning something new. They're relearning something old with a sharper lens. The film revisits moments that lived comfortably in pop culture for years. Red carpet laughter, award show banter, offhand remarks that were brushed off as personality. At the time, nothing felt alarming. But now, placed alongside everything else, those same moments feel loaded with subtext. It's not about guilt, it's about awareness. The documentary lets these moments breathe, resisting the urge to explain them, because explanation would weaken the effect. The power is in recognition, in realizing how easily context can be ignored when success is loud enough. Viewers begin to notice how often questions were redirected instead of answered, how interviews pivoted just before discomfort settled in, how narratives were reframed toward achievement whenever scrutiny appeared. None of this was hidden. It was normalized. And that's the unsettling part. According to the perspective shaping this story, history doesn't disappear. It waits. It waits for the moment when attention slows down enough to catch what it missed the first time. And once that moment arrives, the past doesn't accuse. It reminds. This is where the documentary's tone deepens. The energy isn't confrontational anymore. It's reflective, almost mournful, as if acknowledging how many opportunities there were to ask harder questions and how often they were passed over in favor of celebration. The audience starts to feel complicit, not guilty, but involved. Because these moments weren't hidden from view. They were broadcast, shared, applauded, and forgotten. The film suggests that power doesn't rely on secrecy alone. It relies on repetition, on familiarity dulling curiosity, on the audience trusting that if something were wrong, someone else would have spoken up already. But what if no one did? As this idea settles, the documentary begins to feel less like a story and more like a mirror. One reflecting not just the industry, but the culture that consumed it without questioning the cost. By now, viewers aren't waiting for a reveal. They're waiting for understanding, for clarity about how so much could exist in plain sight without ever being fully seen. And that's when it becomes clear. The most uncomfortable truths aren't hidden in darkness. They're hidden in familiarity. By this point, the story no longer feels contained within the documentary itself. It feels like it has slipped into the real world, where reactions don't arrive as applause or outrage, but as calculation. The tone outside the screen shifts. Conversations grow careful. Words are weighed. Responses slow down. What's striking is how little needs to be said for everyone to understand what's happening. The documentary doesn't show panic. It shows adjustment. Public language becomes precise. Statements feel drafted by committees. Silence becomes intentional rather than accidental. And that kind of silence carries meaning. It suggests that the narrative has reached a place where improvisation is risky. Attention turns to process, not spectacle, but procedure. How institutions react when questions gain traction. How systems begin reviewing themselves quietly, away from cameras and comment sections. This isn't about reacting to public noise. It's about assessing exposure. The film implies that when enough dots align, momentum doesn't need encouragement. It builds on its own. Old material gets re-examined. Past decisions are revisited with new caution. Not because someone demanded it, but because ignoring it now carries consequences. This is the phase most people never witness, where nothing dramatic happens on screen, but everything shifts behind it. Meetings occur that were never scheduled before. Files are reopened without announcement. Conversations change tone without explanation. What makes this moment powerful is its restraint. No dramatic score, no declarations, just the understanding that the story has crossed a threshold. It's no longer about opinion. It's about responsibility. The documentary doesn't celebrate this. It treats it as inevitable. When narratives become too consistent to dismiss, systems respond, not to protect reputations, but to protect themselves. And self-preservation is one of the most reliable forces in any industry. Viewers sense the gravity tightening, not because of what's revealed, but because of how carefully everything is now handled. When power becomes cautious, it's rarely because it feels confident. It's because uncertainty has entered the room. The story reaches a quiet intensity here, the kind that doesn't rely on shock, but on realization. That what began as a documentary has become a reference point, something people will return to, quote, indirectly, and consider before making decisions. There's no resolution offered, no outcome promised, just the understanding that movement has begun, and movement, once started, doesn't require permission to continue. As the screen holds on this moment, the audience feels it clearly. This is no longer about what might happen. It's about what has already started to change. As the story nears its end, the weight of everything that's been shown begins to settle in a different way. Not as shock, not as outrage, but as recognition. The kind that stays with you long after the screen goes dark. The documentary doesn't rush toward conclusions. It resists the urge to tell viewers what to believe. Instead, it circles back to something simpler and more unsettling. Memory. How easily it can be shaped. How often it's guided by success, charisma, and repetition rather than clarity. By now, the audience understands that this was never about exposing a single moment. It was about tracing a pattern across years, about showing how power learns to protect itself without ever announcing that it's doing so, about how silence, image, and proximity work together to create stability that feels natural, even when it isn't. The film lingers on the idea that culture doesn't just reflect power, it reinforces it. What gets celebrated gets repeated. What gets ignored fades. And over time, that process feels less like choice and more like destiny. What makes this realization uncomfortable is how little resistance it meets. Viewers recognize the cycle because they've lived inside it. They've consumed it, shared it, defended it. Not out of malice, but out of habit. The documentary doesn't ask for apologies. It asks for awareness. It suggests that accountability doesn't always arrive through dramatic moments. Sometimes it begins with rewatching, with rethinking, with noticing what once felt invisible. As the final stretch unfolds, the tone becomes quieter still, almost reflective, as if acknowledging that the hardest part of any reckoning isn't confrontation, it's acceptance. Accepting that systems don't change quickly, that narratives don't unravel all at once, that truth often arrives in fragments, not declarations. There's no promise of resolution here, no guarantee that questions will be answered publicly or neatly. The film seems to understand that real change rarely announces itself. It moves gradually, through pressure rather than force. What remains with the viewer is not certainty, but curiosity, a heightened sensitivity to patterns, a reluctance to accept easy explanations, a sense that some stories deserve patience, not dismissal. And in that way, the documentary accomplishes something far more lasting than exposure. It shifts how people watch, how they listen, how they interpret power when it presents itself as stability. Because once your perspective changes, it doesn't reset. It carries forward into every interview, every headline, every carefully worded silence that follows. And that may be the most permanent impact of all. By the time the story reaches its final moments, there's no tension left to manufacture. It doesn't need it. The weight is already there, sitting quietly, asking to be acknowledged. What began as a documentary has turned into a lens, one that changes how everything before it is understood, and how everything after it will be judged. Not because it delivered answers, but because it disrupted comfort. It made certainty feel premature. It made silence feel intentional. The film doesn't position itself as the end of a conversation. It positions itself as the moment the conversation could no longer be avoided. And that distinction matters. Endings suggest closure. This feels more like awareness. There's a realization that settles in slowly. Systems don't collapse when questioned. They adapt. They absorb pressure. They adjust language. And they wait. Which is why the most meaningful change doesn't always look dramatic. It looks gradual, careful, almost invisible. The audience is left understanding that accountability doesn't always arrive with headlines or verdicts. Sometimes it arrives as discomfort, as hesitation before speaking, as a pause where there used to be confidence, as a need to choose words more carefully than before. What lingers most is not suspicion, but responsibility. The responsibility of paying attention, of not confusing polish for truth, of recognizing that power, when left uninterrogated, becomes indistinguishable from normalcy. The documentary never claims to define reality. It challenges viewers to reconsider how reality is presented. Who benefits from certain narratives? Who disappears when others rise? And how easily repetition can replace reflection. In its final seconds, the story doesn't point outward. It turns inward, toward the audience, toward the culture that consumed success without questioning its structure, toward the habit of waiting for someone else to speak first. There's no call to outrage, no demand for allegiance, just an invitation to stay curious, to stay aware. To understand that once perspective shifts, it doesn't return to its original shape. Because the most powerful stories don't tell you what to think. They change how you think. And once that happens, the reckoning doesn't end. It continues.